On this episode of Cooking with a Corgi, I'm going to show you how to make risotto. Risotto is a northern Italian dish that is rice cooked with broth for a very long time, and at the end you get a very creamy texture from your rice. The magic of risotto comes from the rice that you choose to use. You can't use just any rice. What you need is a high starch content rice, which tend to be the short to medium grain rices. This rice here is Arborio rice. It comes originally from the northern parts of Italy, and it is the rice that is traditionally used while making risottos. While risotto is just rice and broth, no one wants to eat just rice and broth. So normally you will jazz it up a little bit with different toppings. Today we're going to make a risotto that has pears, prosciutto, and sage in it. It's delicious. We've had it before. It's one of our favorite risottos. The ingredients that we're going to be using, we're going to start with chicken broth. Chicken broth, you can use whatever you want. You can use chicken broth, you can use turkey. We choose to use unsalted chicken broth because we can add however much salt we want. If you get salted chicken broth, you're pretty much stuck with whatever the salt content is. We have the Arborio rice, as I mentioned before. We have sage, we have prosciutto, we have a few pears here, a little garlic, a bit of an onion. We're gonna need a little bit of olive oil. This is a small bottle of white wine. And then at the very end, we're gonna add in just a little bit of butter and a little bit of Parmesan cheese. The rice is already creamy, but it adds a nice texture and flavor at the very end. And for equipment, you're gonna need two things. You're gonna need a large pot. This is where your risotto is gonna be cooked in. And then you're gonna need a much smaller pan. This is gonna be for preheating the broth that you're gonna add to the rice. You wanna start this recipe by heating up your broth. Risotto takes a lot more broth than you probably might expect. We are cooking 1 cup of dry rice, and we're gonna need 6 cups of broth. So I put 6 cups of broth in here, and you wanna bring it up to a simmer only. You don't want it too hot. You want the simmer to be so that you're seeing some bubbles forming around the edge, but you don't want it to be rolling in a boil in any way. Put this on the burner, put a lid on top so that it doesn't evaporate, and while you're doing this, you can prepare your vegetables and other ingredients. You wanna start with 1 or 2 pieces of prosciutto. Then you want to select 5 or 6 really good sage leaves. These are going to become a garnish later. Next, you want to peel and dice up your pears. You want to separate the pears into 2 equal-sized batches. Then you're going to cut up some garlic and some red onion or shallot. You're going to measure out 1 cup of the Arborio rice, followed by 1/2 cup of white wine. Then you're going to cut up about 1 or 2 tablespoons of sage leaves. You're going to set aside 1 or 2 tablespoons of butter, and then you want to have some olive oil, some salt, and some pepper available as needed. Add a couple tablespoons of olive oil to your large pan and heat on medium-high until the olive oil is shimmering. Next, add your strips of prosciutto to the hot oil and cook until crispy. When the prosciutto is done cooking, place the strips on a paper towel to let them dry. Add the 5 or 6 sage leaves that you set aside earlier to the hot oil. They're going to crisp up very quickly, so be prepared to take them out after only a few seconds. Add your onion and your garlic to the pan and cook for about 1 minute or until fragrant. When the garlic and onions are brown and fragrant, add the dry rice to the pan. Stir the dried rice around for a couple of minutes until it becomes translucent. This process will toast the rice and give it a nuttier flavor in the end. Now add the 1/2 cup of white wine to deglaze the pan. With the pan deglazed, it's now time to add your first batch of diced pears. By the time the risotto is done, these pears will have completely dissolved. Grind in some fresh salt and pepper, and then you're about ready to start adding the broth. The broth should be added in small batches so that you don't overwhelm the rice. About a cup per batch is ideal. From this point on, you're going to want to continue to stir constantly. Let the rice absorb all of the liquid before adding another batch of broth. It'll take about 45 minutes to get all of the broth incorporated.
Pear, are you helping?
After a few minutes, you'll see that the rice has absorbed most of the liquid. It's time to add another batch of broth. Once your prosciutto has dried, you're going to want to break it up into little pieces. Rip it, tear it, crumble it. We're going to incorporate these pieces into the risotto later. At this point, we've used up about a third of the broth, so it's time to add roughly a third of the chopped up sage. You want to add ingredients in stages so that in the end, you have ingredients that are done to different levels. It actually makes a very nice texture and a nice combination of flavors in the end that you wouldn't get if you added everything all at once. Continue stirring the rice and adding broth as necessary. It seems like it takes forever, but I promise the end result is worth it. It doesn't hurt to have a few activities to pass the time. Do you have any fours?
Go fish.
Ron shook his head, wide-eyed. Hermione, however, clapped a hand over her forehead. Harry, I think I've understood something. I have to go to the library. And she sprinted away up the stairs. So with this addition, I will have used up roughly 2/3 of the broth. At this point, it's a good time to add the second half of the pears that you prepared earlier. These pears are going to remain a little bit more crunchy, and you'll have a good texture in the end, whereas the first pears have pretty much dissolved, and they're going to be much more like an applesauce in here. So you have a lot of good pear flavor, but you won't be overwhelmed with chunks of pear as you eat it. Add a little bit more of the sage. Another third or so. And we'll just continue. From here on out, it's not a bad idea to start tasting your risotto on a regular basis to kind of test how done the rice is. It's probably not done yet, but you may not use all of the broth. In some cases, you may actually run out of broth and need more. If that happens to you, and you don't have any extra broth that you could heat up really quickly, you can actually just add some salt water. A little bit of salt water in here will have the same effect as broth, but if it's only a tiny proportion compared to the amount of broth you put in, you won't notice it. All right, so we're getting close towards the end. I'm gonna give it a taste now just to see where the rice is. Remember, it's really, really hot, so be careful. It's really good. And the rice is almost cooked. So I'm gonna give it a couple more minutes on the heat. I won't add any more broth. We do have some broth left, but I don't think we need any more of it. The rice is cooked now. The final steps are to add your tablespoon or two of butter, the rest of the sage that you chopped up. You're going to want to add a little bit of Parmesan cheese and all of that nice prosciutto that we chopped up, crumbled up earlier. You want to mix this until everything's incorporated, the butter and the cheese is melted, but as soon as that's done, the risotto is complete. Here's the final product. Sometimes it's fun to top it with a little extra prosciutto you might have, and you want to remember the fried sage leaves that you cooked up earlier. They're a nice crispy garnish to the top of this thing. I hope you enjoyed learning how to make this delicious risotto dish. If you choose to try this recipe yourself, please leave a comment and let us know how you liked it.